China's zero-tolerance policy on illegal drugs, one of the strictest in the world, is paying off. According to a report released by China's National Narcotics Control Commission in June, China's drug-related cases dropped by 1/3 last year. The number of drug users in China also reportedly fell for the first time. Yet it remains an uphill battle, both at home and overseas. China has also been facing pressure from the United States for being the source of illicit fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's fueling America's crisis in opioid-related overdoses and deaths. How can China and the U.S. resolve their fentanyl-related disputes? Why has China's counter-narcotics efforts been so successful, and what challenges lie ahead? What more can China do to enhance international collaboration? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Earlier, I talked to Tsang Wai-Hung, Deputy Director of the China National Narcotics Control Commission, who was recently nominated by China for the position of Director General of the United Nations Office in Vienna and Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. Mr. Tsang was also the former chief of Hong Kong Police. Our discussion began with China's achievement in narcotics control. In June, the National Narcotics Control Commission released a report about China's drug situation in 2018. It showed that 412 drug production cases were solved across the country. That's 30% fewer than in 2017. The number of drug smuggling cases also went down by 30% from 2017. The number of Chinese drug users reportedly fell for the first time by 5.8% from 2017 and now stands at an estimated 2.4 million. Meanwhile, the proportion of minors involved in drug-related crimes also decreased. I asked Mr. Tsang Wai-Hung, what do these numbers say about China's efforts in narcotics control and what's behind these achievements?
Well, I mean, these statistics are very encouraging. If anything, they are indicative of the fact that we have successfully contained the situation. But there is no room for complacency. We still have 2.4 million active drug users. And that's a lot in terms of absolute number. Of course, if you compare that as a percentage with the world average, we seem to be doing slightly better. But bear in mind that China has continued to grow. The threat of drug is still very real. And the need for step-up effort cannot be stopped. I think the policies that we have adopted and the actions that we have taken against the drug problem in China has been very comprehensive. Take law enforcement, for example. I believe we have been extremely stringent in tackling drug black spots, in tackling manufacturing activities, drug trafficking, even illicit use of drugs. And that is why we're seeing a downward trend in terms of the number of the detected cases. Now, that's only about local effort. And we're also doing a lot about drugs at the regional level as well as at the international level. Now, we can talk about this a little bit more. But when I talk about comprehensiveness, I mean not just reducing supply. We are doing a lot to reduce demand. Now, the first limb of our demand reduction strategy is preventive education and publicity. Now, we have invested a lot of the effort into these areas. And by now, we have trained over 1 million teachers and over 200,000 counselors to help spread the message. And we have launched an internet platform nationwide, and now over 200,000 schools, both primary and secondary schools, have enrolled, and up to almost 90 million of our students are using this website on a regular basis. And we talk about the actual result, of course, is the report of newly of newly recorded drug addicts dropped significantly.
Yeah.
I mean, this is plenty of evidence to show that we are doing all right in this area.
But China also faces many challenges in its war on drugs. This 2019 Commission report also said that China continues to face a complicated situation regarding overseas sources of narcotics. For instance, China seized nearly 30 tons of narcotics that originated from the so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. This was one of the largest foreign drug sources last year and increased by nearly 18% from 2017. China also seized 1.4 tons of cocaine from South America in 2018, up 3.4 times the amount than previous year. Meanwhile, domestically, as in many other countries, China now sees a rise in the abuse of synthetic drugs, and drug traffickers are spotting loopholes in e-commerce and modern logistics. How serious are these challenges? How has China been tackling these challenges? Let's hear what Mr. Tsang had to say on these matters.
Now, I think we have to look at the world situation. We've been fighting drug problem for decades, and to be honest, the drug problem globally has not got better. The number of drug addicts continue to increase, and the supply of drugs, both natural and synthetics, also continue to increase. Now this threat, together with globalization, is getting more and more real to China, and we have to be prepared to deal with this threat. Generic strategy that we adopt include both the demand reduction and the supply reduction. And maybe I should start with supply reduction. Now, domestically in the country, we have taken stringent measures to tackle drug manufacturing, trafficking, even illicit drug use. That is why we're seeing a downward trend in the number of reported cases. But drug problem is always transnational in nature, and that is why international cooperation has been a very strong focus in our work, in our fight against drugs. In terms of international cooperations, we start with working with the international communities to fulfill the obligations under the various drug conventions. Now, this is for the entire world. But to deal with regional problem, we have regional cooperation, mostly with neighboring countries surrounding the Golden Triangle, and also with the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. Beyond this, we also make use of the Belt and Road initiatives to extend the scope of our cooperation, so much so that we are now working with the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in a lot of areas, including fighting drugs. Now, in all this area, we actually provide them with a strong legal basis, and we have signed agreements. I believe we now have 27 such agreements signed with other countries. Plenty more memorandum of understandings with other law enforcement agencies, and that provide the basis for our cooperation.
In the war against drugs, international cooperation is essential. Talking about China's role, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently said that China will devote more effort to fighting transnational organized crime and strengthening international counter-narcotic cooperation. So what kind of international cooperation already exists, and what other plans will be carried out in the future? Does China have a bigger role to play?
Now, China is a developing country and the second biggest economy in the world. Now, its significance cannot be underestimated. Now, in terms of contribution to the international effort, I mean, our contribution to UN will be one of the very best approach that we can undertake to fulfill our obligations in fighting the scourge of this drug problem. But beyond that, actually there are a lot more that we can do, because as we go about working with our neighbors, cooperating with our neighbors, there will be problems arising, and drugs and crimes are going to be among them. And so I think it makes sense that as we take forward initiatives such as a Belt and Road initiative, we take a comprehensive view of the problem and seize the opportunity to make sure that we don't miss any of this risk. You look at regional cooperation, for instance. Now we have in the Golden Triangle, Operation Safe Mekong, where we conduct joint patrol with all neighboring countries to ensure the safety of the Mekong waters, to ensure that they are not being used by the drug traffickers for this purpose.
We also touched the fentanyl issue in our discussion. This synthetic opioid that is fueling America's crisis in opioid-related overdoses and deaths. Ever since 2017, the U.S. has stepped up pressure on Beijing on this issue, arguing that China is the main source of illegal fentanyl flowing into the U.S. A few U.S. media outlets have even accused China of deliberately allowing smugglers to introduce such drugs into the U.S. But China has insisted it has done a lot on controlling illicit fentanyl. Starting on May the 1st, China added fentanyl-related substances to a supplementary list of controlled narcotics and psychotropic substances with non-medical use. Ever since then, according to the Chinese Commission, no production, trafficking or smuggling of fentanyl-like substances was found in China. Mr. Tsang Wai-Hung explained more of the efforts made there.
Now, the fentanyl problem in the USA is an overdose problem. Now, overdose arising from abuse, both by the unmoral medical practitioners or by the users themselves. Now, in order to deal with the threat, I think we have to go back to the generic strategies of the demand reduction. Now, as long as there is a demand for these sort of powerful painkiller, there will always be a supply. So, I don't know, next time it might not be fentanyl, it might be something else. And they need not come from China. And as far as we know, fentanyl can be produced by many other places. And although China now decided to legislate against fentanyl by class, this act alone is not going to solve the U.S. problem. From the broader perspective, I believe the international community is very appreciative of China's effort in fighting drugs, not just herself, but also with partners around the world. Now, as for the fentanyl problem, I think it would be useful to understand why this problem comes about. Now, fentanyl itself is an artificial opioid. It is a very potent painkiller, far more powerful than natural opiates. And its abuse has caused tens of thousands of deaths in the USA. And that is why the USA is very alarmed about this problem. Now, I don't think China is the primary source of the fentanyl being abused in the USA. I mean, there's no evidence to suggest that we are. But in the spirit of shared responsibility, in the spirit for international cooperation, we've decided that, okay, we will exercise more stringent control. And that is why in May this year, we have legislated against fentanyl by controlling it by class, which means that any derivatives of fentanyl will be subject to legislative control. Now, since May, we've taken steps to set up the legal framework for law enforcement purpose, including surveillance on the illicit production of fentanyl in China. Now, from past cases that we have come across, now there are sporadic cases whereby illicitly manufactured fentanyl were being smuggled to the USA, but they were in small quantity. And so far, we have not had any case, not one case, of fentanyl being produced by our illicit manufacturer being trafficked to the USA. Building of trust and understanding is important, and we will welcome our partners around the world, including from the US, to come and see for themselves how we are tackling the problem here in China and what's being done.
Mr. Tsang Wai-Hung has been nominated by China for the position of Director General of the UN Office at Vienna and Executive Director of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. As a Chinese official who has worked for the National Narcotics Control Commission as well as the Hong Kong police chief, what's his understanding of the UN's role in fighting drug trafficking around the world? And if chosen for this post, what would be his top priorities? Here's how he reacted.
China has always supported UN, and I see my nomination as a move by China to further contribute to the work of UN in the area of drugs, crimes, terrorism, and corruption. Now, these areas have direct impact on the well-being of people around the world, and I believe China itself accumulated plenty experience that it can share through my nomination and through my candidature. Now, as far as I am concerned, in my present capacity as the Deputy Commissioner of the National Narcotics Control Commission, as well as my previous capacity as the Commissioner of Police of the Hong Kong Police Force, I also have plenty experience working in this area. I have always been a believer of the action-centered leadership, both in my present capacity and my previous capacity. And my promise is to turn vision into reality through collective action and professionalism. Now, obviously, these pledges is not going to bring result on its own, and that is why I also pledge to support UN, particularly the work of the Secretary General in pursuit of the aims and objectives of UN, including the UN reforms, support member states and international organizations so that they can participate as fully as possible, and support UN staff so that they have the opportunity for to realize the full potential. There's a lot of other things that I will do, including promoting organizational learning, the delivery of organizational goals, promoting organizational development, promoting participation by developed and least developed countries. The list goes on. I mean, there's a lot of concrete things I do, but most important of all is bring outcomes. Let me assure you that the work of UN is the collective effort of member states. Now, whoever is in charge has to gain the goodwill of the member states. That will be my first and foremost task. Now, to gain the goodwill of member states, obviously there will be alignment of goals. I mean, there will need to be promotional collaboration. They will need to iron out differences. Now, these are concrete things that I will do. But in terms of output, already UN promised the world with its Agenda 2030. That is a promise for a brighter future for the entire mankind. And the work of the UNODC is actually covered under the Agenda 2030, under the different strategic development goals. Now, as a candidate, I pledge to deliver what UN and its member states hope to achieve. Now, these goals are difficult, but I believe they are doable.